All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with our Unit 6 review. I've numbered these pages just I accidentally jumped forward or something like that. I'm just going to play the video or reserve the video or just post the video however I can. I'll see if I can make a YouTube video out of it today during 7th period. We'll see what happens. It depends on how long it takes to convert this, but we'll see. You got to believe in the computer because it just takes a while sometimes. All right, so I'm starting over here with number 1, starting at the top, and it says A, B, C, D, E. So we're focused on number 1 right now. First off, natural selection. This was a totally new concept, and who came up with that concept? Darwin himself. You should definitely know his name. If for some reason you don't, I don't know how you got here, but Darwin himself was the one who proposed this as the main mechanism of change. And that's what he's known to do. He's known for proposing that idea, natural selection. It was a really big concept. It's not that evolution was a new idea. It's just the mechanism, how it occurred. And the other thing, I guess I should mention this. I mean, why not? He wasn't just the first one to propose it, but he used evidence that he found. Right? I mean, he went to the Galapagos and he made a lot of observations. He reported those observations, whether or not he reported them ethically or not, based on the work of another dude. Whatever, it's fine. Life is good. I'm noticing these scratches on my little Wacom board, so I'm a little nervous about that. Anyway, so it says it's a major mechanism of change over time, and it really fits in this Darwin's theory of evolution. I also want to just mention here as part of little A right here, and I'm just adding stuff, okay? I'm not changing anything. I just want to add here and say this doesn't affect, or natural selection, I'll say NS, doesn't affect individuals, right? What does it affect? It affects populations. Remember, natural selection means over a period of time, you have to have successive generations that get these beneficial traits. That's the key factor of natural selection. So the better traits become more popular because the ones with the good traits, quote unquote, are more likely to reproduce or better survive to reproduce. And those other traits aren't really selected against. They just aren't becoming popular because the other traits are so much better. So there's a benefit. You also see part B says there's a variation among phenotypes. Genetic mutations play a role in increasing variation. I should just point out to you that phrase of variation, genetic variation, is pretty important. You should be aware that genetic variation leads to these changes over that period of time. Let's see. Not a whole lot to change there. Oh, I should also just mention this kind of off to the side. Where am I? There I am. Evolution itself, and in turn, natural selection, is not goal-oriented. Okay? Once again, evolution and natural selection doesn't take place because, oh, this is the trait that's needed for the species to survive. If that were true, no species would die out, would they? Thank you so much. If that was true, no species would die out because they would have made the adjustments to meet whatever need they have, whatever environment they're in. But we know a lot of species have died off, which of course would make sense now. Oh, well, it must not have a goal because these things still die off. Yeah. Also, hey, another off to the side kind of thing. I'm just kind of jumping around. Sorry. I wrote some scattered notes on my thing, so you're going to get them kind of as they come out of me. I apologize. Are you following? You sure? Yeah. Okay, because once again, you still have good information on the page. I'm just adding stuff. There's these concepts of uniformitarianism. Oh, that's an I. One's called gradualism, and another one's called catastrophism. Do I know how to spell that? No. ISM, right? Did I do that right? Good for me. So uniformitarianism, the key word there is uniform. When you think about people wearing a uniform, that means they're dressed the same. So we're saying change occurs over the same rate, over the same amount of, not necessarily a short period of time or a long period of time, but we're saying it happens at a consistent rate. Gradualism, once again, keyword there, gradual, is slow change over time. And catastrophism is sudden but major change over time. Originally, when people were kind of playing around with this idea, I believe his name was, you don't have to write this down, but Charles Lyell, I think, was the first one to really say like catastrophism was a thing. And he basically said, when I look at the fossil record, when I look at fossils, what could have like preserved them? Probably like a volcanic eruption or a flood, something sudden like that, a natural disaster. And he really thought catastrophism, bless you, played a role in like the design or the preservation of fossils. But anyway, I just want to point out to you, you should be familiar with these because these are the three concepts that really influence Darwin's thoughts on what causes natural selection. And he kind of saw it in a more broad perspective. He didn't just think it was one thing. He kind of thought it was a combination of all three things. Yeah? The really controversial one at the time was gradualism because, well, they were saying it was taking forever to do all this stuff. Where people before were like, that took a few thousand years. But he was like, no, I think it was a lot longer, like millions of years. And that made people kind of ruffle their feathers. Also, I'm just going to ask you this question off to the side. Like, do you think you can explain evolution or natural selection in a real world example? Hint, that's probably going to show up on your test. So you'll probably have to look at like a real life situation and go, oh, is this evolution? Is this an example of evolution? Does this meet my concept of what natural selection is? That's probably a thing you should be self-aware of. Yeah? Do you guys have any questions on section number 1? You sure? Okay. Let's jump to section number 2. I know this is in a different order how we learned everything in class, but it's all a big jumble of things anyway, so they all build on each other. The second part here talks about Hardy-Weinberg Equilibrium. As you guys remember, we did a lot of practice problems, and yeah, you're going to have to solve some problems. No, they won't be nearly as complicated. No, they won't be as complicated as what you saw on your assignment, because those were purposely supposed to be more difficult. And if you can navigate those questions, you should be able to handle the ones on the test with no real difficulty at all. But just try to keep in mind there's the two main formulas, and I'll just write them up here again for you. It's P plus Q equals 1. I know that's already in your sheet, but that's the first formula. And the second formula, I don't really care the order you go in, but it's P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. Everything's got to add up to 1. If you use numbers that are if you use numbers that are greater than 1, and for any value here, you're doing something wrong. You found the wrong number. And also, what's the value that you're almost always given in the question? Not just Q, Q squared. This is always going to be equal to your homozygous recessives. This is going to be the value that always confirms genotypes and phenotypes are the same. When they give you a question, they're probably telling you, hey, we've got these animals. There's some that are white, there's some that are black. The black ones are recessive. Well, if they're black, they have to have homozygous recessive because the only way you'd see a recessive trait is if they have 2 copies of it. So once again, little a means the genotype and the phenotype are the same. That's why we always start off with Q squared. They will never start off a problem with P squared. Why? Because if they, well, I guess they could, but they never will. Because how often would you be able to look at a population and say, oh, see all the white sheep here? I know they could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, but I know this many are homozygous. How would you know that? You can't tell that from just looking at them. You'd have to genetically test every single one. That's like a very unrealistic problem. So they'd never give you P squared. I don't know how they'd know the heterozygotes either. So they always give you Q squared. But actually, after you find out what Q squared is, what do you do to find out the next thing? Yeah, you're going to find Q by finding the square root of it. So whatever this value is that you found for Q squared, you're going to turn it into Q. I don't know why. Let's just make something up here. let's say the Q square value we're saying is 20% of a population has red hair, Chris. So, oh, yeah, I guess so. Hey, wait, actually, we almost have 20 people in the room. That's 10%. Okay. So anyway, Q square is actually equal to 0.20, right? Or 0.2, same thing. If I want to find out what Q is, I have to find the square root on both sides, correct? Okay, so if I find the square root of 0.2, I didn't plan to do this, so. If I find the square root of 0.2, that should be 0.447. So Q is equal to we'll just say 0.48. So if I know my Q value, what am I going to find out next? I'm going to find P next, right? So if I know P plus Q equals 1, and I know Q is equal to 0.48, what's P equal to? There you go. P is equal to 0.52. So I know P and I know Q. So any question they ask me, I already know. If they say, how many homozygous recessives are there in your population? Give me a percentage. Amber? Oh. Yeah. It's not a trick question. They said homozygous recessive. And if you're looking for homozygous recessive, they gave it to you. It was Q square. It's this value. So it's 20%. So you can say 0.20 or 20%. What about your heterozygotes? Or otherwise known as 2PQ? Well, that's 2 times P, which is 0.48, times 0.52, which is a number that I have to calculate for you, because how would you know that in your head? I don't know. 0.499. Wow, we're just going to go ahead and say 0.50. So heterozygous would be 0.5 or 50%. Well, it's pretty easy to guess what the homozygous dominance would be. No real hard math required here, right? It'd be 0.3 or 30%, because once again, these three values here should add up to 1, which they do in this case now, or they add up to 100%. And I know I've done it right. So, hey, that's how you do Hardy-Weinberg problems. If you're doing anything beyond what you see here, you're doing it wrong. If you try to do this goofy thing, if they give you Q square, that's a Q. If they give you Q square and they say, oh, it's 0.2, if you say like, oh, well, I know P square has to be 0.8 because that adds up to 1, you're doing it wrong. That's not how it works, because what you're doing here is you're grouping your homozygotes, your homozygous dominants, and your heterozygotes together. So that's bad. Don't do this. This is not the way to do it. I hope you can understand. You always want to go for Q square, then find Q, then find P, and then just plug that into your second formula and look for whatever you're looking for. P square, your homozygous dominants, these are your heterozygotes, and these are your homozygous recessives. If that's hard to remember, that's okay. I'm giving you another copy of the cheat sheet when you take this portion of the test. So life is great. You're welcome. I know. I'm the best. I'm just a huge, great person. So let me just continue on a thought with number 2. It says 2B. So the Hardy-Weinberg equation was developed because they wanted a null hypothesis to compare real nature populations to something that was like a control group. So they said, well, how can we have a population that doesn't evolve? And they said there are 5 things missing from it, and that's what's listed in B. But can I just add a few notes? The reason they chose a large population is because there would be no genetic drift. One of those factors of change other than natural selection. They also said there would be no migration, which means no gene flow. You should know gene flow is basically the same thing as migrations or exchange of alleles between populations. No mutations. So what we're saying there is no genetic variations. That was a really big thing because DNA evolves. Thank you. Genes evolve through the mutations that naturally occur. This actually is kind of crazy, but maybe this is an aside. I don't know. RNA, right? RNA and DNA. We think the very first genetic information on Earth was RNA, and scientists believe it became DNA because it's more stable and it makes fewer mutations, though it still does. which isn't a bad thing. It's actually still a very good thing. Then we have random mating, because this means no sexual selection. You don't choose your mates in these environments. We're saying it's random mating. And then, of course, no natural selection. So no trait is more beneficial. I'm just trying to explain those 5 categories in different ways. Your oyster crackers. All right, so you guys are aware of what those are. And once again, this isn't natural. This doesn't normally occur. You'd have to have some pretty strange populations. Oh, can I just add this thing in here? Well, hey, it's probably already implied, but genetic drift affects small populations, right? It doesn't affect big populations. It affects the smaller populations. Okay. I guess this would be a good opportunity to throw this in there too. Good for you, Ashley. So, Darwin wouldn't have known this definition of evolution because he didn't know what genes were, let alone what allele frequency was or what gene frequency was. But a change in allele frequency, and in turn, a change in genotypic frequencies, is really how we would define what evolution is today. That's the tangible way to see a change in a population, which is pretty important to recognize. So this is different than what Darwin said because he was an old guy and he lived in the past. So yeah, there you go. He was. In the past? He was a caveman. Darwin was a caveman. It's full circle, guys. We all evolved from Darwin. He was a Cro-Magnon. Homo habilis. There you go. All right, so can I move on to number 3? Okay. How much time do I have left? I can do this. I can do anything. Take a look. It's in our book. It's reading rainbow. I can be anything. Thank you. I was on off-Broadway plays for decades. Yeah, I'm gonna crush it like Fergie. Or Roseanne, one or the other. All right, can I move on? I'm doing it anyway. I already did. Deal with it. Number 3, speciation. I think this is pretty easy to recognize. And we said this a lot, but the big things is that isolation is key. You have to isolate populations from each other in order to see new species appear. Without that, you got a little too much mixing, which isn't going to cause speciation. At best, you'll form hybrids. Remember the hybrid zone thing? Yeah. Hybrids are like recombinations of genes, and they just kind of fill a certain cline, a certain niche, a certain area where they work the best, and it's kind of a blend of the two. But we don't want that necessarily if it comes to adapting to certain environments. Sometimes a dramatic change is a better change. But anyway, you guys will remember there's some different factors that play a role in speciation. We divided them into pre-zygotic and post-zygotic barriers, right? So a simple definition for pre-zygotic and post-zygotic, this is before sex can occur, and post-zygotic would be after sex can occur. And try to keep in mind all of the barriers that we listed, and there were a ton. All of them can fall under the categories either before they could have sex or after they have sex. Of course, after they could actually mate, we're going to see some weird stuff happen in terms of the survivability of whatever the offspring are. But before, they're pretty clear. Once again, it's isolation. That's the key factor that brings us to pre-zygotic barriers. Can I, oh, yeah. Without getting too picky here, can I get a little picky? Sure. Why not? Okay. Because I know there's a lot of definitions that you got to know, and that's kind of the end of the study guide, which I'm sure you guys are studying pretty well. Even Felicia pointed this out when we studied this chapter. This is mostly vocabulary in this chapter. You did. Okay, so where it says 3B, we're going to look at B2. It says different behaviors limit mating. What kind of limiting barrier do we call this? Well, we call this, it's pretty obvious. It's called a behavioral barrier. You should know that. Once again, that's based on things like mating calls or like the little songs they sing. Yeah, just like that. Did we talk about fiddler crabs? They have like their giant claw and they like, hey, 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 they'll fight you. So we'll say like dancing. This may also apply to humans in a weird way. Or movements. Mating calls? Thank you. Yeah. I don't know. I tried really hard. The next one, other than behavioral, we have habitat barriers. I'm just going to get lazy. And this is based on where they're found, right? So you can't have a new species form if the species never run into each other. So if they're physically not near each other, that's a habitat barrier. Next up, we have those, it says mating seasons limit mating. So we call this, its official name is temporal. Just to make your life a little easier, I'm giving that to you. And once again, mating seasons kind of vary in different times of the year, right? Maybe they reproduce at certain times of the year or months, or maybe it's seasons, but it's some based on time, something based on time. So temporal. And the last one is anatomical structures limit mating. There's a funny name for this one too. It's called mechanical. Once again, that's like they could possibly reproduce, but they physically just can't do that because, you know, the parts don't fit together properly. So that would stop a lot of that. These are all good examples of pre-zygotic barriers, right? And also geographic isolation. Of course, that's if they're not near each other, that causes a thing too. But yeah, 3C down here. It says it can take place over millions of years or rapidly, and especially after extinction events. I just want to mention to you, this kind of ties back to that idea of gradualism, right? But there's a bit of a debate. It could also be this thing called punctuated equilibrium. So once again, gradualism is when you see a branching off of species that's kind of a gradual pulling apart. They separate over a long period of time. And the differences become more apparent as more time goes on. Punctuated equilibrium looks more like this. And we see a sudden change with a lot of change in a very short period of time. And then those changes really don't do anything afterwards. They kind of stay that way. It's still a bit of a debate about what species this applies to. But of course, we've seen evidence, like for humans, we've seen a lot of gradual change. We've studied those fossils. But for like lizards, anoles on islands, that happens in 2 generations. That's fast. So that's kind of the idea there. Doing okay? Can I move on to number 4? Okay. So number 4, evidence of evolution. I would just tell you, like, hey, read all that stuff there. Like, it says morphological things, like homologous structures, analogous structures. There you go. That's the right way to spell it. Analogous, and of course, vestigial structures. You guys know vestigial are like leftovers, right? Like the hip bones found in whales. They don't need those because, you know, they don't have legs, but they're left over from a common ancestor, which tells us they probably came from a land-based animal, a mammal as well. Analogous means it would be an example of convergent evolution. So like the butterfly wings and bird wings, they're both wings, they both fly, but that doesn't necessarily mean they evolve the same way. And of course, homologous structures, HOMO, always means same structures, but they have different purposes. And that's a big deal. I really don't know what else to add here. I think 4C says biochemical and genetic similarities. You guys remember comparing DNA amounts to different organisms? Cool, good. That sounds good. You catching on? Okay, good. Let's talk about 5. I know there's a lot of stuff in here about the origins of life. I just want to talk about early Earth for a second. Early Earth was not a fun place to be, right? It was a very violent place. There was a lot of geologic change. We're going through this period of time called the heavy bombardment. Oh, we had this thing called a reducing atmosphere. What can you tell me about early Earth's atmosphere? No oxygen, or at least very little oxygen, very small amounts, but not really enough oxygen to sustain life. So that was really important to the atmosphere of early Earth. Now, there was this scientist, there was actually a couple scientists involved. There was this dude named Oparin who said, like, this primordial soup was a thing. And he said, like, hey, if you have, like, heat and you have, like, all these components, even though there's no oxygen, I think life could still form. And that led to the experiment called the Miller-Urey Experiment, right? Can somebody tell me what happened to the Miller-Urey Experiment? Yeah. So from early Earth's atmosphere, which was no to little oxygen, it led to the formation of amino acids. Because all they did was electrocute it and heat it up and give it water vapor and some other goodies. All things that seemed reasonable for being in early Earth's atmosphere. And they were able to form amino acids. It also goes on to say in here, in your little notes here, it says inorganic precursors. I don't know why I want to note this to you, but we usually call these wow, that's not a P. Protobionts, or sometimes called protocells. They're not alive. They're not living things. They're pre-cells, right, Justine? Right. So those protocells, they had their own membrane, but they just couldn't really reliably reproduce and kind of live on their own that way. So that's why they always stayed limited in areas. The magical thing is that it somehow happened. You will see 5D. I'm just kind of making a note over here. 5D. 5D says the Rna World Hypothesis proposes that RNA could have been the earliest genetic material. By the way, one of the big giveaways for this is that all life on Earth shares a genetic code. And I don't mean like everybody has the same DNA or all organisms have the same DNA. What I'm saying is it's all still DNA. It's all the same language that's shared. That's a big giveaway for relatedness between organisms. If life would have sprung up in different ways with different organisms, they would have nothing in common in terms of DNA. But also, RNA probably came first because it is catalytic. Who can tell me what catalytic means? Sure, yeah. So we're saying it has the ability to break down things, start basically forming an early metabolism and actually being able to create something from it. So we can create early metabolisms, we can start to self-replicate, and RNA also acts as a genetic source of information, right? So that's kind of like a good start. DNA, not self-catalytic, that's not a thing. Okay, cool. Anybody have any questions on section 5? Can I move on? I'm going to hit the button. It's just going to go away. Thanks, Ashley. Okay, number 6. It talks a lot about phylogenetic trees and cladograms. Hey, you're not going to have a phylogenetic tree or cladogram on your test because I think you guys understand them. They're pretty simple. You see the variations and the splits. But you see the relatedness of species is through common ancestry. This is a huge concept. This is how phylogenetic trees give us our information. It kind of says that at the end of 6C. It says common ancestor or ancestry is what we're looking for. That's one of the main things that are shared there. Yeah. And you could even phrase this as evolutionary history. Cladograms, pretty much the study of evolution in general, is just trying to show us the history of how origins of species have occurred. It also shows us basically where our common ancestors have shown where those traits are, maybe what conditions they were in. Looking at their biogeography can help us tell what adaptations they have made to make them more likely to survive in their environment. Once again, beneficial traits get passed on in successive generations, and that's natural selection. You guys doing okay? You guys have any questions? You sure? All right, so I guess we'll open it up. Do you guys have any particular vocab words that you want me to define? I know literally it's like not a secret. All of them are pulled from one particular Quizlet that's online that I posted on the website. You should be looking at that because that's where I've always been pulling my things from. That's where they are. There's 1,000 terms in that thing, but all of these terms are pulled from that one thing. So, Felicia? Sure. Essay questions. Sure. Yes, I am. Yeah. So, molecular would be just DNA mutations, right? But those evolutionary would be that you have to intermingle populations. So that'd be gene flow and genetic drift, or bottleneck, or founder's effect, or however you want to phrase it. But both of those would work for under genetic drift. I mean, I guess you could say the size of the population might play a role too, just because genetic drift affects a smaller population better. I guess just the randomness of mating or non-randomness of mating, that's important too. That would be mechanical. There you go. Any other questions? You'll probably notice there is a decent amount of overlap between those 5 questions because I'm only picking 2 of them. So, no other questions? Seriously? I don't have any questions that relate to it. Of course, you know what radiometric dating is. You know, carbon dating is really common. We study isotopes. Isotopes have different numbers of neutrons. If we count the number of neutrons basically available, it gives us a sense for how old it is. And we try to find the most stable elements we can, so we get a longer lifespan, and we see what their half-life is. But beyond that, you're good. Yeah. Term number 42. Let me slide. Nope. Comedic isolation is, how can I phrase this in a nice way? Yeah. Egg. Gosh, my handwriting gets worse. And sperm can't interact. And this is likely because of like protein structures that are on the egg. So the sperm literally can't touch it. It's like a force field around the thing, or the sperm gets identified as like a foreign body and it gets destroyed in there. So literally it's a barrier that stops them from going there. It's technically also a prezygotic barrier. I guess it depends on the individual organism. But anyway, yeah, probably is a prezygotic. I believe it is. Any other questions about terminology you'd like me to define? Anything like that? No?